Today's video is a very special one because we're going to be drafting a pattern from scratch based on our personal measurements. This is all made possible by a system called the Golden Rule by Letterlow. I've owned this Golden Rule system for about 4 years now and just recently received the newest binder edition. Using this system, you can adapt any of their patterns to fit your body based only on your bust and hip measurements. You can take any of the patterns from their binder and enlarge the image using just a ruler and a series of dots. Then you connect the dots and you have personalized pattern pieces. Today we're sewing pattern 59 from this latest collection of patterns. This is a woven pattern and I'm using a lovely lightweight linen. We're going to sew this pattern as usual from start to finish. This time that includes creating the pattern pieces themselves. Let's get started. So here is our Golden Rule kit, which includes everything we need to create our pattern today. A marker, tape measure, scotch tape, push pins, acrylic rulers, and the binder of patterns full of designs for men, women, and children. Before I get started, I like to make a copy of the pattern I'm sewing to preserve the original. As we draft, we will associate our bust measurement to every dot at the waist and above, and our hip measurement to every dot below the waist. I take the copy that I made and tape it onto a large sheet of paper. I'm using butcher paper here. I place a little bit of cardboard underneath the pattern to protect the surface that I'm working on, as I'm going to be pushing a pin through the number that corresponds with my bust measurement, which is 80 centimeters, and push that into the cross marked on the pattern image. Now I can pivot my measuring tape to align with each plot point. Let's start with the 3 dots along the waist. I line up my tape with the numbered line associated with each dot. Here along that tiny line reads 21. So I make a dot with my marker at the 21 along the side of the ruler. The next line at the next dot reads 17, so again I make my dot this time at the number 17 on the measuring tape. And I repeat for the next dot. Now the waist is done, so I change my pin placement to my hip measurement of 88 centimeters. And I finish marking the dots in the same way as before, butting the tape up against each tiny line and transferring the plot points. Now for my favorite part, connecting the dots to mimic our tiny pattern image. Now we can transfer any marked notations from the binder sheet onto our pattern. Here we have a facing that's 4 centimeters wide, so I'll transfer that. And we have a side zipper measuring 15 centimeters, so I'll mark a notch there. Also, I'm going to be designating the center front and center back, and that I'll be cutting one each for the front and back. These codes and labels are all explained on the cheat sheet included in the binder. These patterns do not include seam allowance, so I will be adding 5/8 of an inch with my own seam allowance rulers. I'll also extract the facing here to create a separate pattern piece, and I'll label it and include seam allowance. And we're ready to cut our fabric. So I'm cutting my front and back skirt, front and back facing, and I'll also cut out my interfacing and grab a zipper. Now let's make a pretty skirt. Here is one of the side seams of my front skirt piece. And I'm going to sew finishing stitches from the waist to the hem for both side seams for both the front and back pieces. Now that all of my side seams are finished, I'll place my front and back pieces right sides together and pin one of the side seams. Then I'll sew my side seam with my seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch from top to bottom and press the seam open. I've gone ahead and applied interfacing to the wrong sides of both of my facing pieces. Now I'm going to put them right sides together and pin one of the side seams. Then I'll sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. I also went ahead and finished both sides of the seam allowance using my serger. And now I'm also going to finish the bottom curved edge from one side to the other. Now I'll open up my invisible zipper. Then I'll take it to the ironing board and lightly press open those coils on both sides of the tape. Then I'll place one side of the zipper right sides together with its corresponding side seam. So if you're working with your right side seam, you'll place your right zipper tape right sides together with that seam. We want the top zipper stop to be 5/8 of an inch away from the top raw edge and the zipper teeth to be 5/8 of an inch away from the finished edge of the skirt, and pin in place. Using my zipper foot, I'll sew from the top of the zipper to as far as I can get to the bottom of the zipper, sewing close to the teeth. Now that the one side of the zipper tape is applied, we can attach the other side of the zipper tape right sides together with the remaining side seam. Once again, pinning it in place so that the top zipper stop is 5/8 of an inch from the top, and the zipper teeth are 5/8 of an inch from the finished edge. Then we'll sew this side of the zipper in place, sewing close to the teeth just as we did on the other side. Now that the zipper is fully installed, I'm going to close it and pin the remainder of this side seam. Now with my zipper foot still installed, I'll continue sewing this seam from where my zipper stitches ended, backstitching to secure, continuing for a few inches until I switch back to my regular presser foot to sew the remainder of the seam at the same 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I've pressed those seam allowances open on the zipper side of the skirt, and I'm going to open up the zipper and turn the garment right side out. Now we're going to start attaching the facing. On the zipper side of your skirt, open out that zipper so that it's laying flat. And match up the open end of your facing with the finished end of the skirt. And pin in place. Do this on both short ends of the facing. Now we're going to sew these short ends of the facing to the skirt, sewing through the zipper with our zipper foot and a 5/8 inch seam allowance, both sides. Now we're going to take one zipper side seam and fold it back toward the facing along the seam that we just sewed, and pin in place. Repeating on both sides. And then continue pinning all the way around the waist, matching the side seams. Then sew your facing to the skirt all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that we've attached the facing, I'm going to trim the seam allowance at the top corners and continue trimming that seam allowance all around the waistline by about half. Then we're going to turn the facing up and away from the skirt, and we're going to understitch. We're going to press that seam allowance up toward the facing and then stitch the seam allowance to the facing with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from one side of the zipper to the other. As you approach both sides of the zipper, your presser foot won't allow you to understitch all the way to the corner of that zipper, so just go as far as you can and backstitch to secure. Then we can turn that facing to the inside of the skirt and poke out those zippered corners. And then give that waistline seam a good press. Once that's pressed, to help keep the facing nicely to the inside of the garment, I'm going to stitch in the ditch of the side seam. Stitching from the outside of the garment, placing my needle directly into this seam, backstitching at both ends to secure. Now for the bottom edge of the skirt, I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges all the way around using my serger. The hem allowance that I added here is also 5/8 of an inch, so I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press those raw edges to the wrong side by 5/8. Then once that's pressed, I'm going to sew close to my finishing stitches all the way around the bottom of the skirt. Give everything a final press and your skirt is complete. Thank you for joining me for today's very special sewing adventure. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sew-alongs, and I'll see you in the next video.